Thank you. Yeah, I'm going to try to give a little bit of a comparative perspective on similar issues in Peru. I was involved in monitoring what is probably one of the most important human rights prosecutions in the Americas to date, and that is the trial and conviction of former President Alberto Fujimori. I did that work for WOLA, and this eventually led to a bigger research project monitoring human rights prosecutions in Peru beyond the Fujimori trial, of which there are many. I'd like to start by talking about the role that government documents played in the Fujimori trial, and then I'll talk about the broader judicialization process in Peru and try to talk about some of the problems therein and how it relates to the access of information issue. So just to begin with the Fujimori trial, government documents were absolutely essential to reconstructing the organizational structure, operations, and activities of the Colina Group, a military unit operating within the Army Intelligence Agency that carried out a number of massacres, extrajudicial executions, and forced disappearances during the first few years of the Fujimori government. These documents were especially vital to establishing the links between the Colina Group death squad and the president at the time, Alberto Fujimori. How were these government documents obtained? The answer is through a variety of ways. Some documents had been linked by Colina agents or whistleblowers, including military officers, at the time of these massacres. So for example, a map was leaked to the press by a Colina Group agent that allowed investigators to locate the partial remains of some of the victims in the Cantuta case, a case of 9 students and a professor who were disappeared, and that was one of the cases for which Fujimori was prosecuted and eventually convicted. Some documents came from investigations into the Colina Group crimes, believe it or not, by military courts. Remember, in Peru, an amnesty law was not passed until 1995, and until that time, all through the 1980s and into the mid-90s, cases were brought before regular courts on a regular basis. They were almost always turned over to military courts, and yet the military courts produced documents that in many cases have been useful to at least establish some of the facts of the cases. Other documents were obtained by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission during the course of its investigation. The commission was operative between 2001 and 2005. They obtained numerous military manuals that previously had been classified as top secret, and no one had copies of them. And some, there were only a few, but some military officers gave testimony to the Truth Commission. There's not a lot of new information there, but there is some. In 2001, the Barrios Altos sentence handed down by the Inter-American Court for Human Rights permitted trials to reopen in Peru. The sentence basically, it not only found that the Peruvian state was responsible for the Barrios Altos massacre, which occurred in 1991, and ordered the state to investigate and prosecute those responsible. It also ordered that also determined rather that the 1995 amnesty laws lacked legal effect, and so that allowed investigators and prosecutors to reopen human rights cases. So judges almost immediately began indicting military officers for grave human rights violations, and especially in the case of the Colina Group. At this point, the Fujimori government had collapsed. These were folks on the run, and it wasn't that difficult, or not that it wasn't difficult, but it was easier than it had been in the past. Including former head of security Vladimiro Montesinos and the head of the army Hermosa Rios, who were already in jail on other charges. And in this context, a handful of Colina Group members ended up turning state's evidence and provided important documentary and other types of evidence to help establish the context of the Colina Group. So one Colina Group operative, whose nickname is Maflo, provided his registry of Colina Group victims. It's a smaller registry than the Diario Militar, but it's a registry nonetheless of around 50 victims of the Colina Group between 1991 and 1993. He also produced records of expenditures that helped place Colina Group agents at the scene of the crime. He also provided a transcript of General Hermosa's lunchtime discourse congratulating the Colina Group members for their work. Chucky Aguirre, another Colina Group operative, helped prosecutors reconstruct the organizational structure of the Colina Group and provided ample documents to that effect. In the case of Barrios Altos, which is one of the cases for which Fujimori was prosecuted, in the context of another trial against these Colina Group operatives, The judge, one of the judges in the case, seized military documents. She literally went into the military archives, seized the documents, and then incorporated them as evidence into the trial. It was probably the first and only time that's happened in Peru. But that material was later used in the Fujimori case. And then finally, there were actually important U.S. government declassified documents that were obtained by the National Security Archive that were of central importance. And Kate was an expert witness that came to the she testified. Thank you. She testified in the trial as to the validity of these documents as evidence that could be used in legal proceedings. And in fact, documents of this sort are now often incorporated into criminal trials for human rights abuses in Peru. And there's this great document that that the archive provided that actually has a former ambassador reporting that about a month after the Barrios Altos massacre at a military parade, he asked President Fujimori about the massacre and said that his government, the U.S. government, was very concerned and wanted an investigation. And Fujimori acknowledged that, and that's in the document, and that completely invalidated Fujimori's claims that he had no idea about what was going on until several years later. So that's the good news. Now I'm going to go to my bad news. In many of the other cases now before the Peruvian legal system, there has been what can only be described as stonewalling on the part of the government and military authorities to providing documents that would help clarify human rights crimes committed in the 1980s and 1990s. While some documents have been obtained or handed over to legal authorities, in many cases, in most cases really, they have not. And this has in fact proven to be one of the key obstacles to criminal prosecutions in Peru. It's not the only problem. I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader context to help understand the connection between access to information, I think, and other problems. So this is part of a research project that I've been engaged in the past, I don't know, year plus. On these broader trials in Peru. I've developed a database that chronicles the trials and traces them over time. I've carried out a lot of interviews with people involved in these cases, from victims to lawyers to judges to prosecutors. I've engaged in trial observation and monitoring, and along with colleagues have reviewed sentences that have been emitted. About 33 sentences have been handed down to date. So the result of this research shows a couple of very concrete things. Number one, only a handful of cases have been tried and sentenced, 33 out of an estimated 1,700 denunciations before the courts. Of these 33, many of them have ended in acquittals. I don't have the numbers with me, but I do have the numbers. There have been very few formal indictments to date. Hundreds of cases remain backlogged and still under investigation at the public ministry. Hundreds of cases have been closed, around a little over 700 in fact, which represents about 40% of the total number of denunciations. So the question is why? What's going on? Why hasn't the Fujimori precedent pushed forward the judicialization process in Peru? What are the obstacles that are preventing these cases from moving forward? And there are many, unfortunately. It's not just one thing. There are many problems. One issue that's obviously a problem is the lack of defense for victims of violence. Based on the research that we've done, which canvassed all human rights NGOs representing victims in human rights cases across the country, only 14% of cases denounced before the public ministry are represented by human rights NGOs. Some cases have private lawyers, but the vast majority have no legal representation whatsoever. And this is in marked contrast with state agents who, as of 2006, have defense lawyers paid for by the state. And I'm not talking about public defenders, I'm talking about expensive private lawyers. Fujimori's lawyer, Cesar Nakasaki, his firm represents the Peruvian armed forces in these cases. He personally represents primarily generals in these cases for reasons that are fairly obvious. Another issue we identified is the insufficient capacity of the public ministry to investigate cases. One important thing we found, which is not surprising given the way that violence occurred in Peru, 60% of the cases occurred in one department, are based in one department, Ayacucho, which was the epicenter of the violence. Ayacucho only has 2 specialized fiscalias, or what do we call fiscalias here?
Prosecutors.
Thank you, prosecutors' offices, to deal with these cases. So there's a huge backlog there. This is a material problem, lack of personnel and resources, but also there's a problem of an absence or a very weak strategic vision of how to develop cases, as well as normative understandings about international human rights and humanitarian law in prosecutors' offices, with a handful of people aside. I mean, there are a few people who get it, but the vast majority do not, even in the specialized tribunals. There was a third thing that we noted, there was a specialized system to investigate and prosecute these cases established after the Truth Commission emitted its final report. In fact, it was a recommendation of the Truth Commission. And the idea of this specialized system of investigative prosecutorial units and of tribunals was so that they could focus and specialize on human rights and terrorism cases. And what's happened over the last 5 or 6 years is that their mandate has expanded to not include not only human rights and terrorism cases, but now also cases of drug trafficking, money laundering, kidnapping, freedom of expression, and so on. And so, just to give you an example of what's happened, in the Sala Penal Nacional, which is the main court dealing with human rights cases in Peru, only 10% of their caseload is human rights cases. So they've lost specialization altogether. And they don't have time now to do human rights trials. So, for example, the Ajomarca case, which is a case that I've been working on, following, observing, it's been in public trial for over a year now. There are hearings only about once every 10 to 12 days for 1 to 3 hours. And so at that rate, at that pace, this case will probably last another year, maybe longer. The Barrios Altos case, not the one involving Fujimori, but the one involving all the Colina Group operatives, was 5 years in public trial. Now, admittedly, these are complex cases. There were over 30 defendants in that case, but 5 years. After 5 years of investigation, so it was a 10-year process. Cases are centralized in Lima. This special court that I mentioned handed down a directive which says that in any case of human rights in which there are 2 or more perpetrators is a complex case and therefore should be remitted to Lima. Now, remember I said almost all the cases took place in Ayacucho. They're all being sent to Lima to be tried, meaning that the victims don't have access to the cases. That's another big problem. I'm hesitant to say last but not least because there are a number of other cases, problems, but I'll say it anyway. Last but not least, access to information is a central issue. As I said earlier, more than 700 cases out of 16 or 1,700 total denunciations have been archived primarily due either to lack of evidence, but more likely due to inability to identify the perpetrators. And that constitutes about 40% of the total caseload. Identification of the perpetrators is a key issue here. Soldiers and officials, in the context of Peru's internal armed conflict, typically use noms de guerre, and so oftentimes survivors and witnesses only know those pseudonyms. They don't know the names of the soldiers and officials who were on the scene, who were committing the crimes. Now, it's reasonable to believe that the state has that information, that the armed forces has that information. We know that they do. We've seen, how do you say fojas de servicio in English? The employment. Foja de servicio.
Career, their bio sketches.
Right there. Every year, your superior has to evaluate your service. And so on those forms, your nom de guerre appears. So that exists, and we've seen it. It's not impossible to find the information, but it has to be handed over. And in the case of Peru to date, this information has routinely been denied. I'm going to come to that in a second. Human rights lawyers and state prosecutors have, on numerous occasions, requested access to military records from the Defense Ministry in specific cases to identify perpetrators so that they can formulate indictments against specific individuals. In a handful of cases, the Ministry of Defense has handed over information, and that was a very short period of time between 2005 and 2006. As of 2006 forward, almost always the Ministry of Defense argues not that there's a national security exception, but the information doesn't exist. We burned those documents, they say, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Sometimes there's no response at all, which often happens. just going back a little bit, there was a brief window during the government of Alan Garcia, during the end of the Toledo government when this all started, and the government of Alan Garcia, in which it appeared as if the Ministry of Defense was going to make a good faith effort to redress this problem. Alan Garcia's first defense minister, Alan Wagner, proposed a directive that would have mandated that all functionaries of the Defense Ministry, the Armed Forces, and its decentralized units should respond directly to requests for information, and he developed a proposal that would allow for mechanisms to organize and control the administration of archives in possession of the Ministry of Defense, the Armed Forces, and its decentralized units. So in that period, under Wagner, some information was released. When Wagner stepped down, from then on, all successive ministers of defense have adopted a completely different stance, a stonewalling stance, an argument that these documents do not exist, they have been incinerated, and so forth. And on the contrary, they've also launched a very aggressive campaign to discredit the judicialization process as an orchestrated campaign launched by NGOs and state prosecutors to politically persecute the armed forces. The Defensoría del Pueblo, the Human Rights Ombudsman's Office, has called attention to this problem, and I'm just going to quote briefly its 2007 report to that effect. It says, contradictorily, the defendants in these human rights cases have presented before the corresponding authorities certifications of employment, that's what I was talking about, the FOCAs de servicio, certifications of employment, that contain specific data about the unit, time and service, and labor carried out, which makes evidence that the information solicited does exist within the institutional archives. And this has been corroborated in interviews with human rights lawyers and government prosecutors. I had one interview with one of the two chief prosecutors in human rights cases in Ayacucho, and he said that they had managed during that brief window in 2005, 2006, to obtain these employment records for military officers and soldiers, and they were using those records to try to reconstruct the chain of command. So that they could identify who was responsible in the context of specific massacres and where that led. Right, and most likely it would lead up to the military, at least the military base in that region, perhaps the head of the political military command in that area, because in this time, in the context of Peru's conflict, areas that were in conflict were run by political military command, so the army was basically in command. So there were generals basically directing counterinsurgency strategy in those areas. But now, prosecutors and lawyers are telling us that it's almost impossible to get these employment records from the Defense Ministry anymore, and when they do arrive, they're heavily edited. And especially edited is the information about who the superior officer doing the evaluation is, so they can no longer construct that chain of command. So this is, as I said already, is resulting in resulted
means
in
deleted, or edited means changed.
She said edited. That was her word.
That's just.
It could be excised. It could be. She implied that they were being changed.
Gloria Cano said they actually changed.
They were being
altered
changed.
documents.
That's right. That's right. Now, in some cases, what prosecutors and rights lawyers are trying to do is, and this is complicated, and I'm not a lawyer, but they're trying to focus, instead of focusing on the material authors, focus on the quote unquote intellectual authors. So they're trying to bring cases, and they've actually brought cases against the high-ranking military command, either of the political military command that was in the zone at the time of whatever massacre we're talking about, or the head of the army back in Lima, right? The problem is, of course, that without really documenting the chain of command, it's hard to demonstrate the connection, and those cases might fall flat. There's a real danger of that happening, I think. This is the case with Gavito's trial, which is currently underway. And 2 weeks ago, the state prosecutors brought an indictment in the Putis massacre, which is a massive massacre, 123 people massacred by armed forces in late 1984. Over 20 of those massacred were children. It took 8 years of investigation. The state prosecutors were very nervous about trying to bring this case because they had no information about perpetrators, and they had tried on multiple occasions to get the Ministry of Defense to provide information. They were constantly that was constantly refused. And so finally they brought a case indicting the heads of the local military base. And we're not certain what's going to happen with that. Judges have only very rarely sought to compel the armed forces to cooperate in providing records to the court. As Gloria Cano once said, the judges do not demand the information. They are satisfied with the statement of the defense ministry that there are no documents. Now, it's important to note that Peru does have an access to information law. It was approved during the Toledo administration in the early 2000s, but it's routinely ignored. And so far, the Araguaia case has had no impact here, but I think that there's a need to expand understanding of the implications of the Araguaia case and help people figure out ways to apply it in the Peruvian case. In August, I interviewed the Minister of Defense, who was just kicked out in the most recent cabinet shakeup, which is not a bad thing. His being kicked out is not a bad thing. He was a former military officer. And he was quite disdainful of these requests for access to information, and he very clearly said that the Army had its own administrative decrees governing management of archives. He said those decrees said that Army records would be were to be incinerated every 5 years. He told me that they even prepared acts of incineration to document the destruction of the records. So I asked him whether they retained those acts. I would like to review them. He said, oh, yes, of course, we do have those acts. And then he thought about it and he said, no, actually, I think those were also incinerated. So this brings us to, I think, the broader political context in Peru, I think there is a broader political problem here. The political will to investigate and prosecute these cases has no longer exists, frankly, and it's obviously the opposite. There has been an attempt in the last several years of the Garcia administration to obstruct these processes. There have been multiple efforts to actually impose new amnesty laws. There were 2 bills that were proposed in Congress in 2008. Neither of those succeeded in going very far. Then in 2010, in September, Garcia passed an executive decree that basically was a veiled amnesty law. It was met with widespread domestic and international opposition, and he, in the end, revoked the law. But as you can see, there have been numerous attempts to basically end the criminal prosecution of human rights cases in Peru. What can be done? Just a couple of ideas here, and I'm probably running out of time. But in Argentina, Cristina Kirchner ordered, I'm sure there were limitations to this, but she passed an executive decree ordering the military to hand over its documents to prosecutors. Could be as simple, if there were political will, the president could do that. Judges could be more aggressive in ordering the military to hand over documents in specific cases, or they could take possession of military archives, as the judge in the Barrios Altos case did. This requires political will. Judges are incredibly, at least in Peru, I think it's probably true in most of Latin America, very susceptible to the broader political winds. And where they see no political will, or where they feel pressure, which is definitely the case in Peru, they're not going to do that. They're not going to rock the boat. Public ministry and civil party lawyers or the Human Rights Ombudsman's office could try litigating access to information cases. I think that's a possible route. It's a long road, but I think it probably a few things left for human rights groups in Peru to do on this particular issue. Again, I think the broader problem in Peru is that there is, as Gustavo Gorriti said at the Lima meeting, a counteroffensive of amnesia in Peru. And again, it's these attempts by the military and conservative political and business sectors to discredit criminal trials as political prosecution against the armed forces, discredit the human rights NGOs and democratic judges and prosecutors as advancing a pro-terrorist agenda. They actually say that. And reasserting narratives of denial, which say that either that the army did nothing wrong, or that what they did was necessary in an attempt to return Peru to stability and democracy. Again, I think these point to larger problems about the need to fully democratize the armed forces in Peru and in other parts of Latin America, establish more specific mechanisms for government transparency, and strengthen and fortify the political and societal will to investigate and prosecute human rights violations.